You're listening to Smart Moves with your hosts, Ann Riley Caldwell and Matt Wilson.
Hey guys, welcome to Smart Moves, the podcast where we help you make smart, strategic, and hopefully smooth moves when it comes to real estate here in Middle Tennessee. I'm Ann Riley Caldwell, not your ordinary agent, and I'm here with my friend and amazing loan officer, branch manager, Matt Wilson with New American Funding. And today we're picking up with part 2, talking about the purchase and sale agreement. Don't get burned because you didn't know what was going on, and the document that you signed that starts as an offer and hopefully ends up as a contract. So we're going to pick up talking about the appraisal section, and we're going to go through the last, I won't tell you how many pages, of the purchase and sale agreement. All of it's important, so also make sure you go back and you catch our first podcast talking about the purchase and sale agreement, where we made it through the first few pages and pretty much most of the financial parts. Next up, we have an appraisal section. So either the agreement is not contingent on an appraisal, which means that no matter what the home property appraises for, you're going to have to buy it, at least from that aspect of things. So if you put a contract on a $500,000 house and it only appraises for $450,000 for some reason, then you're still going to have to buy that $500,000 house. So most of the time, the only times I see this box checked is if it's a cash deal. Most cash buyers don't want to hire an appraiser to go out there and appraise it. They feel like that it's close enough, probably based upon what they offered for it, and they're just not going to worry about it. Or in multiple offer situations, we've seen people check this box. Back in the day when it was crazy and there was 20 to 50 offers on a house, one of the ways to try to get your offer accepted was to say that you were going to waive the appraisal contingency. So in that instance, you better just make sure that if that house appraises low, that you have the money to make up the difference.
Yep. And on our end, I've had people in the past that are like, oh, they didn't do the appraisal contingency, so that means there doesn't need to be an appraisal. Well, if you're financing, the lender decides that. Fannie and Freddie's going to decide that. So just because you check that box doesn't mean an appraisal is not going to be ordered. It's just that that's not a way for you to get out of the contract or have an ability to renegotiate it if it doesn't come in as high as you would like. Now, on another one of these, we could talk about appraisal gap strategies and things like that you could use there. But all that to say, you don't have to put as much down as you might think you would if it did appraise super low. Just know that it's what's on the contract and what your lender's requiring are not necessarily one and the same.
Correct. Because I have that all the time. People are like, but I checked the box. And I'm like, yeah, but the lender's still at the percentage of loan that you're getting. And that doesn't mean it's not going to have an appraisal. So, and then, of course, you check, most people, I'd say a huge majority of people check the box that says the agreement is contingent upon the appraised value equaling or exceeding the purchase price. And then again, we can talk about that in another podcast, what happens if it doesn't appraise. The next section is important. I tell people to read this, not that they always understand it, but they can ask questions. Closing expenses, seller expenses, buyer expenses, title expenses. It takes up almost the whole page. So these are by default, by contract. There are certain expenses that go along with closing most deals. Some are categorized as seller expenses, which means that by default, the seller is responsible to make sure that those are paid either ahead of time or almost always at closing. There might be a couple of exceptions to that. Buyer expenses, there's another list of things that the buyer is responsible for paying. Title expenses, for some reason, there's a blank and you guys get to decide. I'm not sure why that's not a default to somebody, but it's not. So anyway, for title expenses, there is a line that has to be filled out. Is the buyer paying it? Is the seller paying it? Are you splitting those expenses in some way? Title expenses are the cost of doing a title search, which is the title company is making sure that the people who own the house really own the house. There's no outstanding liens other than maybe a mortgage, or all those are found and paid off at closing, etc. And then there's also title insurance policies that cover the buyer and also cover the lender. So anyway, there is a line on that one in particular. If you want to make any changes to these default provisions, then there are lines for us to do that. So this is where when you hear the phrases such as the buyer is going to have the seller pay part of their closing costs, then this is where this page becomes extremely important. And this is where the buyer is going to ask the seller to either pay a certain amount or up to a certain amount or up to a certain percentage of the purchase price. And in that instance, again, this is where the buyer will have spoken to Matt in great detail and know if they need money to close, how much money they would need to close because they don't have it themselves, or they have it, but just from a strategic standpoint, we're going to try to get them to keep part of it. And we're still going to ask the seller to contribute. And of course, there are also instances where nobody asks for anything and they just pay their default quote unquote expenses. So anyway, this is a huge strategic thing. Negotiations often happen on this front. And again, if a buyer does not have enough money to bring to closing, then they definitely need a contribution from the seller. So as Matt knows, I send everything to him if we're not, if it's not zero, and just triple check based upon all of the things with a specific property that a buyer wants to make an offer on, just making sure that the buyer really knows if there's like a mandatory amount that they're going to have to get.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the biggest levers with first-time home buyers. This is probably, in my opinion, the most important section of the contract because most first-time home buyers are strapped with cash. They're not exactly, sitting on a down payment plus closing cost in most cases. So this is the spot where if it's a $350,000 listing and you think you could get it for $10,000 less, go ahead and offer $350,000 and get $10,000 in closing costs. It means the same thing to them, but it keeps $10,000 in your pocket. So the other factor here too is where it's got the title expenses line broken out from the other stuff. Depending on how you do your verbiage there, it's going to give you the ability to potentially get like some kind of bonus money, so to speak. Because like if you put title expenses to be paid by seller and then put closing costs to be paid by seller, then as long as you don't say closing costs plus title expenses to be paid by seller in that second time, you get to bonus it. So it could be $2,000 or $3,000 in title expenses plus $10,000. Well, guess what? If we've got extra money there, we're just going to help you buy a lower interest rate with it, is what we're going to do with that extra money. So there are several tricks that you can play. That sounded bad. I mean, it's not a trick, it's just a contract, but there's several things you can do that make it more advantageous to you as a buyer. And if you're selling a house, to be mindful of, if your agent's not Dan Riley and wasn't making the heads up play, you may be on the hook for a couple thousand that you didn't realize you were. So,
well, and I would say you can chime in on this real quick. Some of the verbiage and some of the language that I have seen when I'm the listing agent that some buyers put in here don't always make sense, or is not doing for their buyer what they thought it was going to do for their buyer because of how they write it. There are, I would say there are right ways and wrong ways to do this. And then there's also okay ways, but even better ways. So I strive for the even better way to make it clear for all parties and also to get my clients, what they think that they're getting when we put that in there. But I would say this is one of the places in the contract where you can have a complete train wreck and people get right up to the point of closing and the seller thought it meant one thing and the buyer thought it meant something else. And I've seen contracts fall out over this section in particular because no one could agree on what it meant. So
yeah, for sure.
It's very, very, very important.
Yeah. The most egregious version of that I've ever seen was one time I saw one that said seller to pay up to 3% of the buyer's closing costs, which is probably like a couple $100, if that.
Right.
So, there's a big difference in that verbiage versus seller to pay up to 3% of the purchase price towards the closing costs. So even simple stuff like that, man, like it's That was the ugliest one. I called back everybody. I was like, hey, did y'all mean to do this? Because this doesn't really do anything. And they were like, no. So they sent an amendment in and fixed it. But it could have got to closing and blew up if the buyers thought they were getting, $9,000 on a $300,000 purchase, and instead they got, $300.
Yeah, exactly.
Could have been ugly.
Whoops. We're missing some zeros and some other stuff. Well, that, and I would say too, I had a thought. Hopefully it'll come back to me. Also, I take classes all the time, and I take a class from a person who used to lead the Tennessee Forms Committee that puts all these forms together. And whenever possible, I might be one of the only agents I've seen. I use the terminology that's actually already defined in the contract. So I call it buyer expenses so that it covers that whole paragraph. There really is no definition for closing costs. There is no definition for prepaids. There is no definition for all the things technically that's in that buyer expenses paragraph. And I've actually had an agent friend of mine, he put closing costs, and technically closing costs really only covers about a third of that buyer expenses category. And he had an agent on the other side that was smart enough to know that. And instead of getting the money that they thought that they were going to get to cover all those buyer expenses, including discount points, buying down the rate, all that stuff went away. And he ended up having to take his commission and pay the difference because somebody actually called that out and said, well, 2/3 of this paragraph really technically are not closing costs. So most of the time it slides. Most of the time agents don't know that or don't call it out on behalf of their clients, and it goes through. But I'm just telling you guys, if these things are not worded correctly, you are potentially, if there's a smart agent or party on the other side, you could end up with way less than what you thought when you get to closing. And if you're not, I guess if you don't have the money and they turn you upside down and they shake you, I'm not sure what happens, but technically you're in breach of contract. And if you do have the money, you're going to be coming out of pocket for that money because it's you and your agent that didn't write it correctly. So anyway, there's just a huge, if we have like sirens and warning signs on our video editing, we might want to put those up.
That'd be a good spot for them. Yeah. And it's not really a free for all either. Like you can't just get whatever you want, however much you want. There are limits based on loan amounts. Or loan types too. I won't go into all of those because that would be a video to itself, but do speak with your lender before you get your closing costs paid to make sure that you can actually use what you're getting there. And I've also seen people add this after the fact, like if there were repairs that were found to be needed in the inspection, like they'll come back and add this in lieu of repairs. For the love of God, though, don't say in lieu of repairs ever, 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 ever on your contract, please, because your lender is going to look at it and be like, oh, what repairs? And it's going to be a bad day for all involved, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's one of the things, again, not all agents know that, and it can create huge issues. And yeah, you don't want those questions flying around. There are ways around it, and there are ways that I know how to get around it that are legitimate. They're the right way to do it. So the next thing up, we'll speed through some of this. The top heavy part of the contract is the hardest. Next is places to put the title company for the buyer, title company for the seller. The title company, again, they're the people that will actually do the closing. They're actually doing the title search. They're working with the lender to make sure all the numbers match at closing, to make sure everybody's on the same page about how much money is being brought to closing by the buyer, how much money the seller's going to walk away with, making sure that all those expenses that we talked about get debited and credited on the right sides of the settlement statement, etc. Sometimes you see both parties use the same title company. I'm not a huge fan of that, but you'll have to call me and ask me why. The next part is earnest money, trust money. So within a certain number of days, typically, there's actually some places I found out in Clarksville where they just don't bother to do earnest money. And I said, yeah, we don't do that. That within a certain, some of the stuff, conversations I have with people, usually within a certain number of days of going under contract, the binding agreement date, the buyer will put down a deposit. It could be $1, and usually it's at least $500, but it can be any amount that everybody agrees on. Sometimes it's a percentage of the purchase price, and then the title company will hold that money. But I always tell people it is a deposit. It is money that you're putting up in good faith. It is not extra money. So when we get to closing, that money will be credited to you as if you brought it on the day of closing. So it's not extra money that you're paying in order to buy this house.
Yeah, that's one people will get confused about that with when I have conversations with them too, especially first time home buyers. They're like, but Matt, I thought I was doing 0% down and my seller's paying my closing costs. I'm like, you are, chill out. You'll get it back at the finish line or close to it. Unfortunately, with the way mortgage math works, there's no way to get it down to exactly the penny, but we'll get as close as we can. But, I always tell people like that's the money that shows the seller you're serious. Because if you didn't have any skin in the game, what's to stop you from just deciding tomorrow you don't want the house anymore and just tossing the contract, At least that way it hurts a little bit if you decide that you're going to do something like that. So, yeah. Outside of that, it doesn't really impact us too much other than just making sure, I guess it does. When you do your earnest money, make sure to do it like via wire transfer or a check from your account or something like that. Like this is not the time to get into fancy accounting and go pull it from your Swiss account that's untraceable in America or something silly like that. We need to trace that money if you want to get credit for it at closing so it can be refunded to you. We need to trace that money through the process to make sure that it came from you to begin with.
Well, and this is one of those things too. Timelines are timelines and all that, but some I feel like are a little bit more important. So you really want to get your money in on time. If you don't, the seller can send you a notification and then you only have 1 day to scramble around and make sure. Otherwise, the seller will be able to terminate the contract. So it's another one of the things that I try to make sure my buyers don't mess up because it just creates issues potentially. Then we're not going to worry about the handling of the earnest money. You get to read that on your own. But closing dates is the closing date. So that is the date that all the parties are going to show up at their title company. Documents are going to be signed. Things are going to happen. And hopefully, the transfer is going to go through. There is a possession box. A lot of times people get possession of their house, quote, at closing. I'll talk about this in more detail, but I always tell people assume you're not going to get in until the next day in case documents don't get swapped, in case money gets sent out too late, etc. But anyway, technically at closing, or there could be something called a temporary occupancy agreement, and we'll do a separate video about that because there's a whole strategy if you're going to try to do a temporary occupancy agreement. The next part of the contract talks about things that are prorated. I will actually let Matt take that because prorated sounds like a financial term and I can explain it, but he can do it better.
Yeah. So the prorations are basically, you're going to have taxes on the property because spoiler alert, Uncle Sam takes this piece out of that too. And on the tax front, you got two taxes. You got your property taxes, and there's also like your mortgage and transfer tax stuff that goes on. But in this context, we're talking about your property taxes that you have to pay every year. You only have to pay for the part of the year that you own the house. You don't have to pay for the part of the year that the seller owns the house. That wouldn't be fair. So they prorate it to accommodate for that. Most of the time, they'll just give you a credit at closing from the seller to cover their portion of the year is the way that they approach that. The other factor there too is like with, and I don't think this is listed in the contract per se, but with the proration of your daily interest, every day closer to the end of the month lowers your closing costs. But it also decreases the amount of time until your first payment's due. Because what happens is when you make your first mortgage payment and it's the month after the month you closed, you've got a whole month there potentially if you close on the first of prepaid interest that's prorated in there as well. So you got to consider that. Now, if you close at the end of the month, then there's only going to be about 32 or 33 days until the first payment's due, but you don't have you don't have all those 30 days of per diem interest in there. That's another lever that I pull whenever you've got somebody that's super tight on funds. Now, for some reason anyway, like the 30th of the month is International Closing Day according to real estate agents. So we typically get contracts like that to begin with. But with that being said, you kind of get into a situation where your closing costs can look a lot lower if they're at the end of the month because you don't have all of that extra interest in there. So anyway, no, I kind of gave you a little bit more than just the taxes there, but it's Likewise, HOA fees and things like that. Like, you're only going to have to pay for the part of the year that you own the house. There's no reason that you're going to be paying while the seller was there.
Correct. And then the closing date, I mean, again, I said there is some strategy to that. It's, what the seller needs, it's what the buyer needs. Typically, I try to stay away from the very end of the month, very beginning of the month. And typically, I try to avoid Mondays and Fridays, but that's just my agent take on that. So we try to do Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursdays in my world. Unless somebody just really has to. Sometimes people can't get off work and they have to do a Monday or Friday. It's not tragic, but it's not ideal, especially Friday. Monday's not horrible. But anyway, Greenbelt is the next thing. So Greenbelt only applies if it's 15 acres or more. We're not going to talk about what it even means in this video. Again, we can do like a random video and talk about stuff like this. But it cracks me up when I'm the listing agent and the buyer's agent checks a box that has to do with Greenbelt and the house is in a subdivision with like half an acre. I just, okay. Anyway, you apparently don't know what Greenbelt means either. Okay. Special assessments. Honestly, I don't get a lot of these, but I find them, I think, a little bit more. Matt can probably talk about this even better than I can. New construction. Sometimes there are special assessments that need to go in this box. Also with HOAs, sometimes there is a special assessment that's been approved, but it hasn't necessarily been paid. It isn't due yet. So sometimes HOAs, for instance, they have to replace a roof and they don't have enough money in the account to do that, which they should, but they don't. So they might have to hit up every single homeowner in that HOA and say, on this date, you're going to have to pay an extra $250 so we can afford to replace the roof or whatever it is that they're doing. So in that instance, I have one HOA that the owner of the HOA stole the money. And so they got hit with a $900 special assessment by the new HOA to replace part of the money that was stolen by the prior HOA. So anyway, in that instance, there is a $900 bill hanging out there that would need to be disclosed and dealt with and make sure probably that the seller pays it before or at closing. So anyway, again, I don't see it a lot, but it happens.
I've never seen it before.
Oh, well, yeah. Most of the time, I think it's an HOA thing. Because most builders have already paid a lot of the special taxes and assessments ahead of time. But warranty transfers is just if the seller has a warranty, like on an HVAC, termite company warranty, different things like that, they can, in some instances, if the company will let them transfer them over to the buyer. Some roof warranties are transferable. Association fees just deals again with there's going to be some fees when there's an HOA to transfer the name from one person to another. There may be some admin fees to run out what's called a statement of accounts just to show whether or not the HOA fees are paid up to date or paid in advance, etc. So that's a fee sometimes that hits a buyer that they're not expecting, to be honest, because it's buried over here on page 5 and it's not necessarily with other fees that we talk about. So sometimes that's a little bit of a shocker to the buyer because a lot of times it is usually $500 to like $1,000 extra. When do you find out about those?
Usually whenever we get title work with their CD estimate, and then I'm like, oh, look, another $1,000 of bullcrap we have to add in here.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It usually comes late in the game. So that's why I always tell my buyers, just assume you might get hit with a little bit more than what you might think.
It's a good way to lose that $1,000 earnest money you thought you were getting back at closing.
Exactly. There you go. So lesson might be to always put $1,000 in earnest money down, so you won't have to bring extra money to closing. Title and conveyance just talks about, the title has to be marketable. We won't go into all that. The name on the deed. So we talked about the buyer name on the first page. It's also important to decide who's going to be on the deed, because sometimes it might only be one spouse that's the actual buyer that's on the loan, but they might want their spouse to be on the deed. Sometimes people who aren't married, maybe only one person's on the loan, but they want to try to put extra people on the deed. I know that I've run into some issues with that before. So do you have any thoughts on when it's a good or bad thing to start adding extra people on the deed?
Well, from a lending perspective, just from pure nuts and bolts of it, just let us know up front so that we can prepare the documentation accordingly. They don't they're not necessarily on the mortgage, but depending on if you're married or not, all that stuff, they're going to have to sign some documents that us and title send out. I would also be 100. This is more like personal Matt advice, not professional Matt advice. Be 110% certain that whatever equity in that house you might have one day, you're okay with having to split with whoever you have put on that line. Because legally, unless I'm missing something, doesn't matter if you're married, it's your best friend's grandma or what it is. Like if they're on there, they own it just as much as you do, whether they're on the mortgage or not.
Correct. And I think we already did a podcast, if you guys want to go back and check it out, where we talk about multiple people being on a property, being on a deed, being on a mortgage, what that looks like, different ways to take title, what happens if one of the people dies. There's a lot to that. It isn't just as easy as let me just slap somebody on here because I like them today. Matt and I had a situation where a boyfriend, girlfriend, only one of them, she was actually the mortgage holder and he was not. And then she decided to sell her property. He had to sign off on everything. They had to agree to what was going to happen with the equity in the house. Thankfully, even though they were actually splitting up at the time, it turned out, I found out later, they were still good enough friends and still got along well enough that they were able to work that out between themselves. But a lot of times it goes in the other direction. You're splitting up, you're not really talking to each other, you're really not great friends anymore. And now that person has a true legal claim to that equity. So be very careful, kids. Be very careful. Who we like today may not be who we like tomorrow. A little life advice there too. The next thing is lead-based paint. So any property built before 1978 has to have a lead-based paint disclosure. It is a requirement. We can talk about that if it's necessary. It is a form that the lender is going to want to see. Most people just say, I don't have any idea if there's any lead-based paint in this house. It's usually been painted over so many times by now that most of the time people think it's a moot point. So inspections, this is a doozy. So I'm going to be really quick on this because we could sit here all day on inspections. But let me say this. One of the big reasons that deals fall out, this right here. So make sure you read it, make sure you understand it, make sure that you don't miss deadlines here because you may end up buying a house that you really did not want. Or you may end up falling out of a contract on a house that you really did want. So when it comes to time frames, I would say, again, if we had bells and whistles and things to go off, this is huge. Unless you waive the inspection, if you're not going to do an inspection, then it's not relevant to anything. But again, I don't see a lot of waivers of inspections unless we have multiple offers. And again, that's a way to get leverage against all the other buyers that want to have an inspection. But there are time frames in here. There are suggestions on types of inspections. Do not miss your inspection period. Within a certain number of days, you better get all your inspections done. And do not make the mistake of thinking that the seller is going to be nice and let you extend it, because they may, but they also may not. Typically, you send out a home inspector, termite inspector. Those are pretty standard. But if things come back on the inspection report about your roof, about your HVAC, especially about your foundation, good heavens, foundation issues have been a thing. You still only have a certain period of time to call experts on something specific and try to get them out there to get the information that you need. If you're not happy about an inspection, there's options as to what we do about that. You can ask for things to be repaired. You can ask for money in lieu of repairs. You can often walk away if it's something that's not cosmetic. There's a lot of things that can happen. So you really, really have to understand this part. You also have to decide, if there's going to be a resolution period. That's a period of time where the agents go back and forth and talk to their clients. And then we try to resolve any issues that came up on the inspection. Again, at that point, that's where people either walk away, move forward, or negotiate something. There's also a completion of repairs. If there is going to be repairs, then that opens up a whole nother can of worms. But that's another document that we don't have to talk about today. And it's a document that Matt never wants to see.
Yeah, matter of fact, anything inspection related, just keep me completely out of the loop. If you don't take anything else away from this podcast today, Never send your lender the inspection. Nothing good comes out of that. I'm going to dump it as soon as I see it and be like, what in the world are you doing? From our standpoint, nothing good comes out of that ever, 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 ever. Your inspection is for you so that you've got the warm and fuzzies about buying the house. It has nothing to do with your mortgage. We're going completely off whatever the appraiser says about it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If there's anything that the lender is concerned about, that's going to come when the appraisal comes. And it's usually more serious things. I mean, sometimes we've had the fun appraiser that decided to be picky about something crazy, but hopefully that doesn't happen. A final inspection is the last time that you get to go out and look at your house before closing. We can talk about the strategy about when to do that, but you want to definitely fill in the blank so that you have the right to do it within a certain period of time, either day of closing or within a certain number of days. There's a whole bunch of due diligence things here that you kids can read and I'll go over with you. There's a disclaimer about all kinds of things that as an insurance brokerage and licensee, which would be me, we don't know anything about, or we don't know much about, we're not experts about. You will also sign a disclaimer document that talks about these. So you will see that multiple times because there's a lot of stuff we know, but there's also a lot of stuff that we can't possibly know. Defines brokerage, which is the company that your agent works for. Default is a big one, just in the sense of, again, there are time frames in here. And if you don't meet certain time frames, you may default on the contract, which has its own issues and remedies and potential lawsuits. Home protection plan. If you want the seller, I mean, the buyer could actually pay for it. Anybody can pay for it. But if you want a home protection plan to be in place at closing and potentially be paid out of the money at closing, then there's a box for that. Otherwise, a lot of people just waive that. If they want one, they get it later. But again, negotiable. Some sellers, when they know that there's things going on at their house, will actually offer it as an incentive ahead of time. So that's one of the things I find out. Then there's tons and tons of definitions. So we can go over those later. There are additional seller obligations, which basically have to do with the condition of the property. There's at least some minimal things, requirements that they have to tell you about. If they live in the property within a certain period of time of selling it, then there's a much longer property condition disclosure that's separate. Exhibits and addenda. Okay, we're wrapping this up, kids. So, I don't have a lot of these, except if you have a VA or FHA loan. There is a VA/FHA loan addendum that needs to be filled out. That actually needs to be written in these lines, which a lot of agents don't do. So anyway, that should be there anytime you have an FHA VA loan. If there's other things that you're trying to add to the contract, then you might need a separate piece of paper to do that. Special stipulations, again, bells should go off, fireworks should go off, things should go off. This is a whole bunch of blanks that are very dangerous, kids. They're just very, very dangerous. As we talked about earlier, defining buyer expenses and other things, this is where a lot of agents get themselves and clients in trouble. So you really want an agent. I don't know how you're going to figure this out, other than I can tell you that if I don't know, I go ask my broker or I go ask Matt if it has something to do with financing. Even though I have sort of a specialized background, I don't mess around with special stipulations. There is a form that I found almost no agents know about called additional contract language that I go refer to. That's supposedly safe to use. So I start with that. And then if that doesn't cover our situation, then I go ask my broker. Because it's just a whole lot of blank lines that people can just write all kinds of stuff. So best case scenario is if there's nothing that needs to be specially stipulated, then just don't do it. If there's something that needs to counteract or be different than all the other lines and spaces and boxes that we had before, most of the time now, if the buyer is wanting the seller to contribute to the buyer agent commission, that goes here. So that is important if you're trying to make that happen. But again, whatever you put here, it just needs to be super clear, because if there's another place where parties are going to get to closing and disagree over something, it's going to be this one. Do you have anything to add to that real quick?
Yeah, it's a pain in our butt, basically. Because usually, the people that wrote the rest of this paper are lawyers, and real estate agents are not, in most cases. Anyway, the thing is that for example, I've got a contract right now, actually, where one of the special steps was that the seller was going to put more gravel down in the driveway. That could have totally been handled a different way, but it wasn't. And it's on the contract. So now we need proof that gravel has been put in this driveway to get closed because from a lending perspective, here we go. The craziest one that I've ever seen, ever, was in regards to moving a mailbox location off of a property line. And that one actually wound up in court over a period. Like, we're talking neighbors that hated this mailbox being in the wrong spot. And it wound up like getting knocked over a few times, et cetera, et cetera. It was pretty wild. It was pretty wild. So, I don't know. You use the special steps sparingly, in my opinion. That's very much a specialized thing. I've seen agents will frequently put the seller paid stuff in the special steps instead of in the line that's built for it. There's literally a whole line we looked at a minute ago. And then instead they throw it down there. Sometimes at a first glance, we'll miss it and then have to catch it on the second one because it wasn't in the spot that it's supposed to be in, So
yeah, I see that a lot. It drives me crazy because obviously I'm scanning a contract when I'm the listing agent, and I'm thinking, oh, they're not asking for any contribution to buyer expenses, etc. And then I get to special stipulations, and I go, oh, there it is. So
yeah, for sure.
Again, it's easy to look over. Also, which is not what you want. Time limit of the offer, there is often, at least in my mind, because I am strategic, a strategy to this. You want to give the seller enough time, but not too much time most of the time. So again, with my clients, we discuss this. I also try to be nice if I'm the buyer's agent and call the listing agent and find out if the sellers are like one seller right now that my buyer might be making a contract on. She's on a cruise ship out in some ocean. So giving her a little bit more time will help all of us to not have to resubmit this contract again, and give her more time. So there are things like that it's good to know. I actually might be one of the only buyer's agents that calls and tries to talk to a listing agent up front and try to resolve some of these things ahead of time. Otherwise, they just have to do it all again. There's a wire fraud warning that's really, really, really important. You need to read it. And you need to double, triple, quadruple check before you start sending large amounts of money to the title company. So that can be another episode too. So we got all kinds of things. Special stipulations could be its own episode. So you kids just wait. We're going to have more fun with more episodes talking about some of this stuff in more detail. At the end, it's important that the buyer signs to say that they're making an offer. And then ultimately the seller has 3 options. They can accept it, they can reject it, or they can counter it. And we're not going to go into counter offers right now. That's a separate document. But if the seller likes most of the things, they have a right to make a counter offer and change the purchase price or change the contribution to buyer expenses, etc. So then we start going back and forth. And we can actually do an episode on counters probably because Matt, they can get to be so confusing. When we get up to counter 4 or 5, I just say, guys, we need to start over and just do a new PSA. Because this is going to confuse everybody. I've got stories. We both have stories about that. So anyway, and then there's just information at the end. So I would say, the things to be careful of are the things that we truly highlighted. Other than obviously the financing piece needs to be in place and make it to closing, and people need to not mess that up, which we've done videos, podcast about already. You really just need to pay attention. Inspections are huge. All the deadlines in the contract is huge. The appraisal matters. And again, anything that's considered a contingency, we just really need to make sure that they get met, preferably in a timely manner.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, the whole game in real estate, in my opinion, is keeping things on schedule. As a lender, the biggest thing I'm judged on is whether or not I close on time. Everybody gets real upset about that. So just make sure you're doing your part to keep everything timely as it's going. Because if you don't have your insurance or your earnest money in time, or haven't talked to me for 2 weeks after you got a contract, well, makes it a lot harder in order to get you closed.
Correct. So anyway, so don't get burned by letting things happen that you didn't mean to let happen. If you need to change things, it's all a negotiation. Things can get changed after the fact, but let's try to get it right the first time because there's no guarantee of that. That wraps up our second episode talking about the purchase and sale agreement, giving you strategic advice and thoughts and things that can go wrong to make sure that you don't get burned by the purchase and sale agreement, which is the contract between buyers and sellers to buy real estate. If you have any questions, as always, make sure that you reach out to us because we're always here to help you. Do everything that we can to get you to a successful closing. We'll see you on the next podcast.